We're busy leading, teaching, running. Introspection and learning are often left out. The more reflective we are, the more effective we are. So I'm pleased to have Ellen Schall here to share her wisdom and experiences on reflective practice. She's a senior presidential fellow with a long list of accomplishments. Her legacy is one of helping to transform organizations by encouraging others to step up to their leadership potential. Leading this conversation is our passionate and distinguished president of NOD, Carol Glazer. She has been tirelessly championing change for underrepresented groups for decades, and we are deeply honored for her wisdom and leadership at the helm of the organization. Carol, I'll turn it over to you.
Are we on? You hear me? This is going to be a very interesting session. I want to say on a personal note to start, before I tell you a little bit about Ellen, is that there are a few people, not a lot, who have influenced my way of thinking of myself as a leader, which is something I came into relatively late in life. And there's no rule book, really. And so I turn to people I call my rabbis. Rabbis don't have to be men anymore in my faith. And Ellen, you are one of my rabbis. I've learned so much from you, and when I'm in a dilemma of any kind, I go to your books, I go to Managing from the Swamp, I go back to Don Schoen and some of the other people who have taught us about reflective practice. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity. And Ellen, you have obviously an accomplished leader. We do not have time to go through your whole career. But I think importantly for this, you were awarded a Ford Foundation Kennedy School of, what do we call ourselves now? Harvard, I'm an alumnus, a Harvard Kennedy School Award for innovation in state and local government. And you also were featured in a PBS documentary on excellence in the public sector. Your experience and ultimate success as Commissioner of Juvenile Justice in New York City certainly played a role in those achievements. In much of your leadership style, you do, as I do, describe as reflective practice. So that's what we want to talk about a little bit today. But first, Alan, we'd really love to hear a little bit more about the experience with Spofford and as Commissioner of Juvenile Justice, and what you found stepping into a role that was extremely challenging, an agency that was in some disarray, that was not serving the young people it was supposed to serve. You had to take control of this, as I said, decrepit prison, really. Although it's hard to think about prison for people that age. And you did some interesting things there. So tell us about those and give us a context for the rest of what we'll talk about.
Be delighted and so glad to be with you. I do want to say I was struck as I was listening to the last conversation about though our experiences, our work experiences have been so different. I've never worked in the corporate sector. The leadership lessons were exactly the same. And it's great to be here and to be with all of you. I have a cold, so excuse me if I have to cough or drink a bit of water. I'm managing as best I can. So, and one more book to recommend along with Nancy's list of books. A book by an NYU colleague, Dolly Chugh, C-H-U-G-H, called The Person You Mean to Be. And she talks about the way each of us think of ourselves as a good person gets in the way of our learning. And being reflective, and that she encourages us to think about being a good-ish person. So it's been really helpful to me as I try to be an effective leader.
Lighten up. We all have to lighten up a little bit.
Right. So the story that I have is really about how sometimes you have to step back before you can move forward. And when I was in my mid-30s, I became the commissioner of the Department of Juvenile Justice. So all of a sudden, I was responsible for an agency although my early work had been as a legal aid criminal defense lawyer. And so I'd been an advocate and a person pushing the system. All of a sudden, I became a person in charge of a system. And that may be similar to some of your experiences or not. But the agency, as Carol described it, was just a complete mess. We were responsible for kids under the age of 16 who'd been charged with crimes. And these were all kids of color in New York, because the juvenile justice system in New York, as in most places, is less about justice and more about the result of a system in which people who are charged with doing something wrong and who have privilege can find their way out of it, but people who are charged with doing something wrong and have less privilege find themselves locked up in the New York City Department of Juvenile Justice. So the mission wasn't clear. There was high staff turnover. There was low performance. It had this case history and failure reputation. They'd just lost a major political battle. And the major facility had had 22 directors in 29 years. So just a complete, wreck. And I had this it's interesting when you say that leadership has to come from the top. I had a very vague mandate from the mayor. Some of you may remember Ed Koch. His favorite line was, "How am I doing?" So he was quite concerned with himself and less concerned with these kids. Although he said to me, don't let them escape and do as much for them as you can. That was the mandate, if you think of that as a mandate. That was the mandate I had. And so I experienced myself as very much a leader from the middle, right? I mean, I had to invent some strategy without really any direction. And so you had asked me to talk about some of the dilemmas that I encountered along the way. So the first was to find somebody who would stay for more than 10 minutes, right? And I used a search firm, and I learned a lot about hiring, and I thought I would just share a bit about that. I used Isaacson Miller, which is a civic search firm, and John Isaacson taught me to look for people who had hunger, speed, and weight. So hunger is this notion that they're self-motivated, that they're driven in the way Brad talked about himself being driven. Michelle talked about the way she's driven. The notion that their sense of themselves demanded that they do an excellent job, right? So you weren't trying to motivate somebody, you were looking for somebody who was self-motivated, who was hungry. Speed is the ability to juggle balls all the time and to learn really quickly. And so you're looking for people who have a story to tell, to Nancy's point, of when they find themselves in a difficult situation, they navigate through it, they learn quickly, and they can manage all the different things that get thrown at them. And weight is the ability to tell the truth up, down, and across, right? And to handle difficulty with integrity, one of the values that PwC put up there on its list. Because often leaders don't want to hear they don't want to hear the difficult stories. And so somebody who can tell the truth with integrity and bring the truth through the system is really important.
Does it take weight to do that?
It takes authority. It takes somebody who can step up and hold their own and say, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but that idea you had, that plan you had, that, it isn't working. People aren't responding, whatever, that kind of story is. Mm-hmm. So the second dilemma we had to figure out was mission. I mean, the basic idea of detention in this country was just to feed and house kids and then get them to court. And that's not a very compelling mission. And we knew we needed to do more. And this is where the idea of reframing comes in. So we stepped back and thought about what if, we looked around at juvenile detention facilities around the country and figured, well, if somebody had figured it out, we would just copy it. If somebody had a good idea, we'd copy it. And nobody had a good idea. And so we thought, we just were stuck for a while. And then we thought, what if we thought about these kids as adolescents in transition instead of kids locked up for committing a crime. And when we reframed, we were able to come up with the idea and invented this notion of a case management system for each kid in, and that we would follow the kids when they got released, and we created an aftercare program. So because kids in detention could be there for a day or a year, it was really hard to figure out what you could do for them. But if you committed yourself to following them through when they returned home to their community, you could then make good on your plans for each kid. And the third thing that was the most sort of interesting dilemma was, and people don't talk about this a lot, was how do you get rid of the people in the way? Right? Because there's this group of people who just sort of are trying to block what you do. And so I had two stories to tell. One I call a lemon switch. So I called up a friend in city government who was in a different agency, and I said, send me your worst employee and I'll send you mine. Let's just switch them. Okay?
Lemon switch.
Right?
Oh,
Because the person who was in...
Watch out,
right.
NOD
The
folks.
person who was in our way, we actually had a switchboard. This is how long ago this was. We had a switch. We were trying to upskill your digital, right? We had a switchboard. And this person was an incredible gossip and just was sort of negative and could sort of move the negativity through the system. And so I gave that person to a colleague of mine in HRA, and she gave me some of her worst. She gave me her worst person, but they had no social network, right? They were, they couldn't build a whole culture of negativity quickly, and it really enabled us to sort of move forward. And then I had a very senior person who had wanted the job of running Spofford and didn't get it, and I called up another colleague and said, I'll tell you what, I'll pay this guy's salary, he can work for you. Because I had to pay his salary one way or the other. And he was just so much in my way, I outsourced him to somebody else. And it was a great, a great improvement in our culture. So I think sort of being tried, and we had 14 unions. I mean, we worked, in a very constrained system. People often say, impossible to get anything done in city government. Not my experience. You just have to be sort of clever about it.
So how did you reinvent the agency, Ellen, to achieve the outcomes you got? So we know you closed Spofford, or is that going to be part of your upcoming story now? That's a fascinating story.
One thing about this sort of reinventing an agency that I often tell people, particularly young people, is that you have to time your stay to the size of the task. So I talk to a lot of young people who want to change the world, and they also want to change jobs every 18 months. And that doesn't really work for me, right? So if you come into an organization and you want to try to change it, you need to stay a while. Because leaving quickly is disruptive. And so how long have you been at NOD?
14 years.
Right. So I was 7 years at the Department of Juvenile Justice. If you take on a major change initiative, you really need to commit to seeing it through. And this notion that you can come and leave so that your career can, move on quickly, I think is really, you do a disservice to an organization. So there are three changes, in my view, in organizational change. There's a sort of articulating a vision, there's diagnosing the present, and then there's trying to get from here to there. And the vision thing is more, to Nancy's point, I think it's more ears than eyes. It's more listening than it is sort of, looking internally and coming up with some notion of what an organization or a future could be. I completely agree that it is trying to understand how the organization got to where it is. And I'm less intrigued with this sort of strategic planning idea and more with what a group of colleagues of mine call a campaign framework. It's like looking for the nuggets of the future in the organization you have and building on that more than it is sort of, coming up with some crystal ball future. I think in terms of diagnosing the present, this goes to Nancy's point about examining the problem more than trying to, and reframing more than solving any particular problem. I'll tell you a story. Yoko Ono, John Lennon's widow, would give kids at Spofford Christmas presents every year, right? And they'd be like a scarf and a little bit of food, and they're sort of really basic things, but it was sweet, right? But what I realized is that our staff, when they asked how many kids, they increased the numbers to include themselves, right? They felt that needy, that they needed to, and that told me a lot about who they were and what the basic challenge was, right? And that if I didn't figure out how to meet the staff needs, I'd never get them in a position to meet the kids' needs. And so there's basic work I think you need to do to understand, and this question that was asked before about somebody referred to it as the frozen middle. You might have the support of the top, but how do you really reach the people you need to reach is a question I think very much about listening.
There's also the concept of listening not only to what is said, but to listen carefully to what isn't said. And that's what you were doing.
Right.
Your folks weren't telling you that they needed these things,
right,
but they did. And when you saw what happened, you learned that.
Exactly.
It's very important to do
Exactly. And then, I'm very much a fan of small wins and of chunking the work. So I used to say, if you think your job is to, reform the juvenile justice system, it's really hard to get out of bed in the morning. It's just immense. And when you think about, your work of, 80% of the people who have disabilities are unemployed.
Mm-hmm. Same thing.
That's a daunting challenge. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very much a fan of chunking the work. How do your job as a leader is to create manageable challenges that people can achieve and then celebrate the small wins. And that motivates people to go on and keep doing, the difficult work that we're all involved in. So I also think in terms of how to engage the staff, that it's about creating groups for people, that everyone needs a group. And that if you don't create the right, appropriate sort of groups and fora for people, they create their own and they're often off task. Mm-hmm. So asking yourself each year, what's the challenge of the work? And then what are the groups that are necessary to get it done? And not assuming that the groups that you created 3 years ago are still the groups you need. I think changing the culture is among the most difficult tasks of organizational change. And what trick for us was to act revitalized before we were, was to sort of imagine we were better than we were and to sort of try to show that, even though we knew that we had this huge gap between the future and the present. And that's a tricky thing, excuse me.
Ken Roman, a former director of NOD and CEO of Ogilvy Mather, one of the largest advertising companies in the world, once said to me, and it was the ultimate comment, Carol, you do more with smoke and mirrors than anybody I've ever seen.
Right. Right.
I shouldn't reveal that to all of you, but
it's exactly the same point, right?
Exactly.
It's like you have to show up as bolder and as more creative and as more powerful than you feel you are, and somehow you move people forward in that way. And if other people see you in that way, then people can begin to see themselves. But it's a funny dance because you don't want to be fraudulent, you don't want to be fake, but you somehow have to.
You do have to be a fraud sometimes.
Right, you have to, show up bigger than you really completely feel you are.
Act as if, we say sometimes,
right.
Rona here, act as if.
Right.
Meaning you may be shivering in your boots and not have a clue about how you're going to solve a problem, but act as if you do know how to solve that problem.
Right, and as if you're worth taking seriously when you know, it's not completely legit, right?
People want to have confidence in you. Yeah.
Right. Getting help when you need it. I mean, I was very young. I was in my mid-30s when I took this on. And I hired a lot of consultants, and I got a lot of help, and I asked for a lot of help. So knowing what you don't know is really important, I think, and hiring people who are better at their jobs than you would ever be. So I don't actually believe in that notion that, you have to do every job, or you wouldn't ask somebody to do something you wouldn't do. It's like, you wouldn't ask me to run the budget. Like, you wouldn't really want me to be running your budget. And so, I think that the mark of a great leader is being willing to hire people smarter than you are at what they're doing, and not being afraid of that, of hiring talent who are better in certain functions than you would ever be, I think is really important. And then finally, this notion of creating opportunities and not waiting to be asked. So the mayor didn't ask us to transform the juvenile justice system or to close Spofford. He said, don't let them escape and do what you can. Pretty vague. And so the notion that you can take the risk of figuring out a bold strategy and then moving forward with it and asking forgiveness, not permission, all that worked.
Can you tell us, Ellen, the moment or series of moments when you had that aha recognition? Hey, I was brought in here to reform an institution that just can't be reformed. Best thing to do is close it.
Well, we didn't close the Department of Juvenile Justice. What we tried to do was close this building that was a horror.
Yes.
Right? And so my predecessor had lost his job over this effort, gotten fired by the mayor. And so we had to build support for closing one single large facility and building smaller facilities in neighborhoods that were closer to where the kids came from so that they could get visits from their families. And, in New York, the process for building facilities is just a horror show. I won't give you the details, but you have to go to community board meetings. You have to try to get support. You have to get support of the advocates on behalf of the kids. You have to get money from the state legislature and the city. I mean, there's sort of, many, as you well know, many pieces to the story. And we persevered, I guess is what I would say. It was ugly, and it's, the not in my backyard, NIMBY we call it, is alive and well, right? And so even though these kids would inevitably be returning home to their neighborhoods, it was difficult to find neighborhoods that would welcome a facility, even smaller, better designed, all of that. And the navigating, I know you're a fan of, leadership, support from leadership from the top. I guess I would say that I've never had that in this story, right? And so we, for instance, the Tom Peters, when they wanted to do this video about excellence in the public sector and they wanted to come and interview the mayor, my view was like the mayor barely knew what we were doing. Like that would be an embarrassing, so I had to go like brief him in advance. And we had to get support from Albany, the capital of New York State. We had to get it through the budget. And the mayor's people had 6 or 7 things that they wanted to be, get money for, and they were ready to throw us off the table. And I had a friend, call me and say, you're about to get off the mayor's agenda here in Albany, and I had to sort of go around the back door and sort of keep it in. So it was a, complicated political story. We ultimately did. There's 2 new facilities. Spofford's closed. It's going to be affordable housing in New York. It's a much better use of the property. But it was a complicated political maneuvering. And the lesson I think here is you have to keep your eye on your goal. You can't assume that the support you think you have will be always there, and you have to have sort of backup and lines in to know what's going on, sort of to protect your agenda. Should we turn and see what questions there are?
I was going to ask about what you're still learning about reflective practice. How much time do we have for questions?
Where are we on time? We have
Well,
like
let's
10 minutes?
Let's take one.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the mic is coming to someone.
Yeah.
I'm Andrea Sussman from Eli Lilly and Company. I was wondering, I loved your story, and I think I actually heard it on the radio.
Yes,
so
it's
I
gotten some
recognized
play.
the
A little
story.
bit. A little bit of
I
play,
loved it
Ellen.
the first time I heard it. Do you have any data on, what happened to the kids as opposed to how they were those that were
Great question.
Yeah.
treated differently?
Yeah, it is a great question. Yes. One of the things that we had to figure out is how to organize that data, because we didn't want to be in the position of saying, send us your kids and they'll do better, right? Go ahead, lock up more kids of color and we'll have better outcomes for them. What we argued was that kids do better. The research shows that kids do better when they get back into school and when they have an adult who cares about them in their life. And so we based our outcomes on that kind of data. Yeah, and we could show both of those things.
Have you tracked the kids for any length of time?
They have, and I haven't been there in a very long time, but yes.
So they can tell you the outcomes
Right.
of the very kids you...
Right. There's another question.
So I'm from Raytheon. I have a quick question. I mean, associated to children. Do you have data on children that have a disability, whether it's hidden or visible, that have a special needs parent that impacts that whole journey, if you would say? So there are parents that do not have, right? And then there are parents that do have a disability, whether it's hidden or visible, right? Do you have any data that suggests that a parent that has a disability is more equipped?
Oh, I get your
Does that
question.
make
No, I
sense?
don't
do
have
you
that data.
Because that would be very powerful data, right? But it would also help those that are the 20%. I thought it was, so PwC has a deck of cards, and I thought it said 75% on them instead of 80. So I've always been confused about that statistic on how you got to 80 versus 75. But so obviously I've been in the spectrum for a long time. So I am a person with a disability. I'm part of the 1% of the 1%, right? Because I'm actually in leadership. I've worked very hard to be in that. But I also have 2 children. One of them has a very severe ADHD, right? He's on medication, whatever. He's going through school. But I have a very hard time finding people that are me that also have a child with disabilities and resources that will allow me to make sure that he has a job in 20 years. Because I have a hard time teaching my children, because I have like a 4th grade reading level, right? So my eldest has a higher reading level than I do.
Yeah.
And they're seeing me as, hey, my mom doesn't know how to read. She's an engineer. She's a manager. She got
This
through
is
the
not,
system.
I don't.
So, I mean, obviously I'm talking and whatnot, but I was kind of hoping for a little bit more of that, because we're here, right? A lot of us in the room probably have a disability. A lot of us have children. And how do we make sure that now that we're going into that space, that we are empowering people right now to get jobs, we are now having children with children that have disabilities?
I understand the importance of your question, but it's not the data I have. Sorry.
I think we need to start collecting it.
Does anybody else want to address that? It's a very interesting question. Anybody else want to
Somebody-
speak to that?
Lori Golden
Oh,
from
great,
EY.
Lori.
And I'm not going to address the question directly, except to say there are probably many people, as you just cited, in the room in the same boat who would be happy to discuss it. I'm one. I'll volunteer right here. I would like to suggest that during one of the breaks, or we exchange cards and form a community to exchange. So before studying it, let's just talk and identify ourselves. So I think
Very
it's a
important.
great point and definitely worth pursuing.
Great.
And oftentimes there's a relationship. In other words, and I'm a person with mental health issues that come about as a result of a son who had both very serious medical issues in and out of the hospital and also physical and intellectual disabilities. And dealing with those things, the stresses and strains. And all of you, I bet, have folks in your departments, in your companies, in your workforce, parents who are struggling with balancing the responsibilities of their job and their responsibilities at home. And it doesn't take too long to slip into an anxiety or a depression or a combination, especially with chronic medical illnesses. So it's not an uncommon phenomenon. Does somebody have a reply, or you have another
So
question?
not so much a reply, but Ellen, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. What a story of courage, and especially so young, right at the time, taking that on in your 30s. My question is, some of the life's best lessons come in reflecting back on the situation, and is there one or two things that, looking back on the situation, maybe you would have done differently? Hindsight being 20/20.
Yeah, of course. One of the early things I did, so I was a young white woman in this role, and the staff and the kids were largely people of color, largely African American. And one of the issues I had to confront early on was staff who would hit a kid. And my view was that was unacceptable, that we were, holding kids, but we had no business harming them. And I got a lot of pushback, like, what do you know as a young white woman, And, but one of the first things I did was discipline a staff who had abused a child. And I wrote a memo about it and said that I wouldn't tolerate this. I think it probably wasn't a great, first week message. Wasn't the way to enter. I mean, I still believe in the point, but it wasn't like the smartest thing I did to start.
This wasn't an Andrew Carnegie move.
No. So that's one of the things I carry with me. And the other is that I ultimately left when Ed Koch was running against Dave Dinkins. And I realized that I would be voting for Mr. Dinkins and not the mayor, and that you shouldn't be working for somebody you wouldn't support. And that lesson has really stayed with me, because I think there are a lot of people in middle management who have huge critiques of their boss, right? And it's fine to, voice and argue, but if you can't ultimately support the person you work for, you shouldn't be working there. And I see that a lot in academic life, where faculty think they're really good critiquers. They're best at that. And I try to bring that forward. I'm like, if you can't, if you can't support the leadership, leave. Those are two things.
Important point.
Someone
Okay,
in
we
there.
have time for one more question.
Hi, Ellen. I wanted to check in on so when you took a bold decision as you did, went against the grain, I wanted to see what tactics you used either actually afterwards to manage the situation and keep your credibility and keep you inside the organization to continue to make change.
Yeah, I think keeping your credibility is such a critical issue. I had mentioned that my predecessor got fired, and he got fired because he lied. He said one thing to the mayor and one thing to the community, and when that got revealed, he got fired. And so I think, and I'm trained as a lawyer and worked, as I said, as a legal aid lawyer for 7 or 8 years. I think your reputation as somebody who tells the truth is just a really important asset that you carry throughout your life. And if people can't trust you, they lose faith in you. And so I've really been trying to be somebody who you could count on, not just to get something done, but to tell you what was going on, to tell you the truth.
Not easy,
Not easy.
always.
No.
Okay. I don't see any other questions.
There's one there, or two.
Okay. Will the powers that be at NOD tell us when we have to get
Move
pulled
on.
off the stage? Karen, we have one or two more?
Thank you.
One question, okay?
One and then wrap up. Okay.
So my question was about you talked a lot about getting rid of people in the way in your lemon switch attempt,
Right.
which made me laugh, but also for organizations or for people who maybe aren't in positions of power to do something as large as a lemon switch, how do you suggest we manage people who are quote unquote in the way or really are disrupting that cultural change or that shift with diversity?
Yeah, I had somebody come to me yesterday to ask a similar question about, I guess my attitude is not to tolerate, not to be hostage to people who get in your way and not to tolerate bad behavior. And so, confronting people early and often and, explaining what you expect and holding them accountable for when they don't perform. It's annoying, it's difficult, it's a lot of work to keep on track of all of that. But I think ultimately it's really important. And your company has procedures that allow you to terminate people if you have a clear record and you've documented all these things. And I think it's really important to keep on that and to say, to write in the expectation of what good performance looks like in terms of inclusion and diversity or whatever the topic is, to have really clear benchmarks and then to hold people accountable if they don't meet them. I just think we can't tolerate people who aren't following the expectations. And so it's easy to say, oh, it's too hard, or it's, it's HR won't let me do things. But I think you can find a way through. Obviously, not everybody can switch lemons whenever they want. But I think if you sort of remember that there has to be an answer to this. I don't accept that this person is just going to be here forever, completely going against what the company wants, that you can find a path. My basic assumption in life is, there has to be a way through.
Terrific. Please join me in thanking Ellen. Good way to start the day.